Hello, everyone. Today is, got some echo coming in. Let's see, is it me? Computer over there, okay. We will call the meeting of the Mining and Forestry Policy Committee to order. Today is Tuesday, February 22nd, 2022, 2222. And today we are going to have a presentation from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency on mining permits and where they're at in the process there, similar to what we did last week with the Department of Natural Resources. So we have the Assistant Commissioner of Water Policy up first, it looks like, or however the Pollution Control Agency wants to do that. You're all welcome to come up. I know you know the system. Just as soon as you're ready, go ahead and state your name and go ahead and get started with the presentation. Members, you should also have in your packet a copy of their presentation as well, if you need that to look at. And for members, similar as before, we'll kind of wait till they get through their presentation and then open it up for questions again. So write your questions down and we'll have them all prepared for when their presentation is done. Go ahead, guys.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. My name is Dana Vanderbosch, and I am the Assistant Commissioner for Water Policy and Agriculture at the MPCA. I'm joined here today with a couple of my colleagues, one in person and another one virtually. And we really appreciate the opportunity to walk through an overview of the permits that we issue to Minnesota mining operations. This is our agency's mission. It's what we're charged to do, and it's what the permits that we issue are designed to accomplish. We absolutely understand the economic importance that mining operations provide for the state of Minnesota and the jobs that they create. And we do our very best to work with industry reps, with companies, with environmental advocates, with tribal nations to make sure that we're doing our best to protect the air, the water, and the land, and still protect these jobs and the economic opportunity that they represent. The MPCA is required to implement both state and federal environmental laws in Minnesota. The Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act have permitting programs that we administer on behalf of EPA. And there are certain commonalities that all of our permitted entities need to abide by, and common processes, administrative processes that they also go through. But the individual permits themselves also contain very specialized permitting requirements. And so for the mining operations, these might be things like how the tailings basin is managed or how fugitive dust is managed on the roads. So there are certain common elements that all of our permittees share, and then there's specific requirements. Mining facilities are amongst the most complicated and complex projects that we permit, and that's because there's potential for impacts to the air, the water, and the land. And so what you see on the slide here is a list of the typical permits that a mining operation might secure from the PCA. There's an air emission permit. There is wastewater that is generated at mining sites that needs to be managed. There's stormwater on industrial sites that needs to be managed. If there is the potential for impacts to wetlands from a proposed construction project, we might have to go through an analysis to explore those impacts as well. And then solid waste, hazardous waste, and storage tank types of permits are very common at industrial facilities. And so a mining operation may need those kinds of permits as well. We're going to start out with the air issues here, and what you see on the screen here is kind of the key issues that we are concerned about as we are evaluating mining facilities during the permitting process. One of the more basic evaluations that we do when we're issuing permits for air quality to a mining operation is to look at the potential that the facility has to emit certain types of air pollution like carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxide, sulfur dioxide, particulate matter, ground level ozone, and mercury. And we look to compare those with the national ambient air quality standards. And those are standards that have been set to protect air quality. And so we're evaluating those standards and the potential to emit those pollutants to see if they're going to be exceeded or not. We also look at regional haze. Regional haze is when particulate matter is released to the atmosphere, and it creates, it reduces visibility, and it creates a haze in urban areas and in scenic areas. So we explore that potential with our mining operations. We also are concerned about fugitive dust. This is mining operations typically have unpaved roads, and when you have those very, very heavy pieces of equipment riding on those roads, all day long, they do release dust. And so we are exploring the potential for fugitive dust from the operation. We also consider greenhouse gas emissions, for example, carbon monoxide, and the potential to impact climate change. And lastly, we look into the potential that the facility has to release mercury to the atmosphere. For example, when you combust coal, it releases mercury to the atmosphere. We do have a statewide mercury total maximum daily load study, and this is a study that identifies the amount of reductions that we need to see in particular areas in order to achieve healthy air quality. And so we've made really, really good progress in reducing mercury from the energy sector and also removing mercury from various products. The statewide goal that's defined in the TMDL for taconite mining operations is a 72% reduction in mercury. Each of the facilities that we permit has submitted a mercury reduction plan, and we continue to work with the industry to try to achieve that mercury reduction goal. In terms of the actual permits that we issue to mining operations, probably the primary one is one that is commonly called the air emission permit. Sometimes it's called the Title V permit. This is a permit that is required by the Clean Air Act, and the EPA is charged with administering that federal program on the state level. It sets requirements on the operation, the air monitoring, and the reporting requirements that the facility needs to abide by. And it's a 5-year permit. So after 5 years, the permit expires and the facility will apply for a reissuance of that permit. If the facility submits their permit application in a timely manner, and if they're not proposing any changes to the facility, we can administratively extend the operation of that permit while we're waiting to reissue the permit. If the facility is proposing any type of construction, they'll also obtain a construction permit. The acronyms on the screen stand for New Source Review and Prevention of Significant Deterioration. Those are 2 federal programs that, again, we're required to implement here on the state level. So we would essentially be looking at the proposed construction and trying to determine if those construction activities are going to violate any of the national ambient air quality standards. Those 2 permits are combined together into one permitting document when the construction permit is needed, just for efficiency and streamlining of permit issuance. We also have state rules that allow us to permit at the state level very small mining operations. These would be facilities that have proposed or potential emissions that are below the thresholds that require a federal permit. So it applies to smaller mining operations, potentially like a scram mining type operation. This permit does not expire, so we do have this capability, this option for smaller operations. Currently, we don't have any of them in Minnesota, though. The general process steps for our air quality permits follow the bullets that are on the screen. First of all, there are certain types of land clearing and grubbing activities that can be allowed on the site, but no permanent structures can be put on the site until the permits have been issued. And so we received the application from the company, and we begin drafting the permit. And drafting the permit could take anywhere from 6 to 12 months, depending on the complexity of the mining operation and depending on the facility's impact on those various different issues that I showed on the previous screen. Once we have that draft permit, we send that draft permit out to tribal nations that are interested in that mining operation, as well as to our permittees. And we allow them a 2-week period to review that draft permit before we put it out on a formal public notice. We answer any questions, we resolve any concerns, and then we put it out for the formal public comment period, which is a 30-day public comment period. We often receive comments during that period too from the public. And so after that 30-day period ends, we take time to answer questions to, address the concerns that were raised. And then we send it off to EPA. Again, these are federal permits that we are just delegated to administer, but they still have to be approved by EPA. And so we send that permit out to EPA and they have 45 days to approve. Provided they approve, then we go ahead and we issue the permit. And after we issue those air permits, there is a 60-day window of time where somebody can challenge that final permit issuance decision. So throughout this whole process, it's a very iterative process where we're working with the company. We're also connecting with EPA and trying to see if we can get an early read on whether they approve of the permit or whether they have issues, so that we're not dealing with issues during their 45-day period. Hopefully by the time we send the draft permit out to EPA, they're already aware of the general permit and they're agreeable to it. So switching over to the water side, again, the areas that we're most concerned about with water as it relates to mining operations is the wastewater that these operations generate. So there's a number of different issues that we are exploring or evaluating a mining operation for when they come to us and they want a water permit. And the chief among them is sulfate. High sulfate concentrations affect wild rice. Wild rice is a really important grain that is needed by waterfowl, and it's also a culturally important grain for tribal nations. The EPA added 32 water bodies that are capable of producing wild rice to Minnesota's 2020 impaired waters list due to sulfate exceeding the 10 milligram per liter water quality standard that we have here in Minnesota. And this action then requires the agency to address sulfate in permits to any facility that is discharging wastewater, upstream of these impaired waters. And so this will impact a large number of facilities, including mining operations. So work is being done. This is a relatively recent decision that EPA made last year, and we're currently developing guidance for how to implement that 10 milligram per liter sulfate standard here in Minnesota. Another area where we need to do some evaluation is what's called the functional equivalent analysis. In short, there was a US Supreme Court case in Hawaii, and the decision requires permitted authorities like Minnesota to determine if discharges to groundwater are functionally equivalent to point sources discharging into a surface water. And so for the PCA, what this will require is some additional consideration for septic systems, for spray irrigation, for land application, and for permitting of tailings basins. So the outcome of this US Supreme Court case will impact mining facilities. The EPA so far has not released the procedure that they want us to take for going through this functional equivalent analysis. They're working on it. In fact, they're kind of developing it based on one of our mining operations. They're actually going forward and developing that analysis for us. So we're making some progress there. We also look at class 3 and 4 standards. Basically, class 3 and 4 waters are waters that are used for industrial purposes, agricultural use, and for livestock. We recently revised those standards, and so now when we receive permit applications, we'll just be checking to see if the proposed water discharge is meeting or exceeding those class 3 or 4 standards. As with air, we also are concerned about mercury in our waters. Sulfate reducing bacteria in our waters releases more mercury into the food web than that mercury gets into fish tissue, and it can ultimately result in consumption advisories for fish. So that is a parameter that we also pay attention to when we're permitting, giving water permits to mining operations. And then lastly, we go through a process called anti-degradation. And basically what that means is that we can't allow a pollutant discharge to worsen water quality that is already meeting the water quality standards. So we have to protect those water quality standards and protect those healthy waters. So at the end of all of this, I do want to just take a minute to acknowledge and express a lot of appreciation for the efforts of organizations like the Natural Resource Research Institute. NRRI has been working with us and communicating with us about some of the research projects that they are undertaking and trying to seek funding for that are seeking to reduce mercury and sulfate from industrial operations like mining facilities. And we just appreciate their collaboration.
I will piggyback on that. Thank you for mentioning NRRI. They're a phenomenal organization. They kind of work through University of Minnesota Duluth. They also have a site in Coleraine. And for any member that hasn't had the opportunity to see the good work they do, it's really fascinating. So I'd highly recommend checking that out to any member, especially that would like to see that. We can help coordinate that if you want to do that.
All right, so I mentioned the list of issues that we are looking for when we are evaluating permit applications for wastewater discharges, and then I'll talk a little bit about the permit specifics. So the water permit that is the main vehicle for these wastewater discharge permits has an unwieldy name called the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, otherwise known as the NPDES permit. And as with the air permit, this is a federally required permit. It's required by the Clean Water Act, and the PCA is the delegated authority to administer that permit. And again, it authorized the discharge of treated wastewater to our surface waters. It includes discharge limits, it includes monitoring and reporting requirements. And as with the air permit, it also has a 5-year permit term. So once that 5-year permit is reaching expiration, the facility will submit a permit application to us. If we receive it in a timely manner, and if they're not proposing any changes, we can administratively extend their operation under that permit while we work to reissue a new permit. Mining facilities also require a state disposal system permit. This is, it's a state permit required by Minnesota rules. And this authorizes, this regulates wastewater discharge to the ground surface or to the subsurface to protect groundwater. So these two pieces, the NPDES piece and the SDS piece, are combined together into a single permitting document for efficiency. The process for wastewater permitting is very similar to the process for air permitting. The company will submit an application to us. We review that application. We draft the new permit. The length of time it takes to draft that permit is really dependent on the various different analyses that we need to go through related to, in particular, those various different issues that I mentioned a couple of slides ago. Some of them can take longer than others. There's a pre-public notice period where we offer the draft permit to tribal nations that are interested in that particular mining operation, as well as to the permittee. We address and resolve any questions or comments they may have, and then we put it out for the formal public comment period. And that's a 30-day public comment period. After that is over, we respond to the public comments. That can take a variable amount of time depending on how many comments we get and how complicated or lengthy they are. And then we send that draft permit out to EPA for review. And generally, we're looking for the EPA to approve that discharge permit within a 30-day window of time. And as with the air permit, we're communicating with EPA throughout the drafting process so that they're generally aware of the permit that they're going to be receiving. And if there's any red flags or anything that is new that we have never done before, that they have an opportunity to weigh in on it early. So we have some sense of whether they're going to approve the permit or not. And then we issue the permit if they approve it, if EPA approves it. And again, there is a window of time after the permit's been issued where somebody could legally challenge that final permit. And for the discharge permit, the NPDES permit, it's a 30-day window of time. Mining operations are also required to obtain an industrial stormwater permit. I mean, it's an industrial site, and so stormwater needs to be managed on that site. This too is a permit that's required by the Clean Water Act, and it's administered by the MPCA. So this is a very common permit for industrial, for industries in general. And it's a general permit, and so there are certain requirements, terms and conditions that are applicable to everybody, every facility that needs this type of industrial stormwater permit. But then the facility will complete a pollution prevention plan, sometimes called a SWIP, that has specifics about how they're going to manage on their specific site, how they're going to manage that stormwater on their specific site. This stormwater permit can be rolled into the NPDES and SDS permit so that it's a whole package for streamlining and for efficiency of permit issuance. And most of our mining operations choose to do that. But it's completely up to them. And if they chose to just get the industrial stormwater permit as a standalone permit, the application period and obtaining the permit is very quick. I mean, typically it just takes a few days to send in a complete application and then get the industrial stormwater permit. And this is generally a 5-year permit. I mean, the general permit as a whole lasts 5 years. And so once the general permit is reissued, everybody who's covered under that general permit needs to apply for coverage under the new general permit. If the mining operation in question is also planning to do some construction, or if it's a brand new facility, and in other words, the project involves some kind of construction that is going to disturb more than an acre of land, they also need to get a construction stormwater permit. And so this construction stormwater permit is effective during the time that the construction is taking place, and its purpose is to just manage stormwater from the construction site. You know, when ground is bare and, you know, there's rain, our biggest concern is that the soil is going to erode and that it's going to flow into lakes or streams or ditches nearby. And so the task with this permit is really to try to keep that stormwater on site and to manage it during construction. And similarly, this is it's a general permit, so there's general terms and conditions that every permittee needs to abide by. There is a stormwater pollution prevention plan that identifies the specific measures the permittee will take on the construction site. And application and receipt of the permit is really very quick. If it's a very large project, for example, disturbing more than 50 acres of land, we do have engineers who will review the construction plans and the measures for controlling stormwater. But outside of that, it's typically you apply for it and you get that construction stormwater permit within a few days. I mentioned before that there are other permits that a mining operation may need to obtain. And so that would be things like a stormwater or a solid waste permit may be needed if they dispose of coal ash or demolition debris or petroleum contaminated soils. They may need a hazardous waste permit if they are managing a certain volume of hazardous material. For example, materials that are combustible or flammable. And they may need a storage tank permit if they are storing very large volumes of, you know, petroleum products on site. Excuse me. So these permits are pretty simple to apply for and to comply with, and they're pretty standard within industries. And then there's just one more area that I'll touch on, and that is the 401 certification. Again, if a facility is proposing a project that is going to require construction and that construction has the potential to impact wetlands or streams, they may need to obtain a 401 certification. This certification is required if the facility needs to obtain a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Section 404 permit. And what the 401 certification will say is that the project does not cause a violation of the state water quality standards. And in order to be able to say that, the permittee may need to do some type of mitigation. They may need to do some replacement of wetlands. They may need to buy some wetland credits. They may have to do some type of monitoring. So it's possible that they may have some special conditions that they have to abide by to obtain that 401 certification. And typically it's a 10 to 30-day public comment period for those certifications. So I just want to conclude my presentation by really recognizing and expressing appreciation for the industry's commitment to address water quality and to work with us to reduce CO emissions. That is something we definitely recognize and appreciate. And again, I just also want to highlight when organizations or educational institutions like NRRI are proposing projects to try to seek ways to reduce some of the more difficult to manage pollutants like sulfate and mercury. It is just helpful for us to work together in partnership and collaboration to make sure that we are doing our due diligence to protect air, water, and land, and in a way that still safeguards these mining jobs and the economic opportunity for the state. And with that, thank you very much. And we can, I think, entertain some questions if you have any for us.
We'll go ahead and open it up for questions. Let's see here. If anybody has a question, if you can, we'll start with Senator Coonan. For anyone else online, if you just use the hand up feature, then I can note that you have a question. Senator Coonan.
Thank you, Chair. I have a question. When you do these public notices and you allow for public comment periods, where are those usually posted? How can people find out that that is happening?
Assistant Commissioner.
Mr. Chair, committee members.
Recording
thank
in
you for that
progress.
question. We always post our public comment notices on our own website. That is one area that we post it. I do want to kick that question over to some of my colleagues. I have the Assistant Commissioner for Air here. He can help me fill that in too for the air permits.
Mr. Chair, for the record, my name is Craig McDonald and I serve as Assistant Commissioner for Air and Climate Policy. And as my colleague noted, we do post comment periods on our website. We also are required to post in local newspapers and opportunities like that for comments as well. And we post information when there is a public information hearing too about when people can attend that in the local newspapers online. We also have listservs through kind of people have signed up to receive regular updates on mining or other issues that we will email out that listserv to so folks are aware of the opportunity to provide comment.
Senator Coonan.
Yep. May I ask another
Yeah,
question?
go ahead.
Yep. I have a few.
We'll let you
here.
go as many as you want. We'll let you do your line of questioning first.
Thank
So
you.
go ahead with as many as you have.
Sure. Let's see. Around the wild rice beds and the sulfite, and I wanted to know when there are higher levels of that that current level in these rice lakes, how is that addressed and how is it reversed, or how do you address that to correct it?
Assistant Commissioner.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, anytime we're dealing with an impaired water, the standard practice or the way that we manage it is that the water will be listed for the pollutant in question, whether it's sulfate or whether it's phosphorus for eutrophication. And once that water is listed, then immediately the agency needs to consider that impairment as we execute our water permits. And so for every permit that is issued after that water is listed, we need to evaluate the discharge, and we need to determine if the discharge in question for the permit we're working on is going to exceed the standard, and if it's causing or contributing to that impairment. And if so, then we need to put a limit in the permit. So that's how we manage it for regulated parties. But some of these pollutants are also, caused by unregulated sources. So we also complete something called a total maximum daily load study. And again, I mentioned those earlier in my presentation, and what a TMDL will do is it will identify all the different sources that are causing or contributing to that impairment, and it will allocate kind of an allowable, it will actually indicate what kind of reductions we need or how much allocation all of the various different contributors can have in order to return that water body back to a state of health. And so we abide by those with our regulated parties by translating them into permit limits. But for the unregulated parties, it is voluntary. Those reductions are voluntary. So.
Senator Kunish?
So what are some of the uncontrolled or what are some of those incidences?
Sure. Mr. Chair.
Assistant Commissioner?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, committee members, I'll use phosphorus because that is a very common one that we're working with. And so when we're dealing with a phosphorus impairment, wastewater treatment facilities, for example, might be examples of regulated parties that are contributing to those kinds of impairments. And so they are getting phosphorus permit limits, and unregulated sources could be things like stormwater coming from communities that are so small that they are not required to have a stormwater permit. It could be agricultural sources. It could be failing septic systems that are leaching phosphorus into the water body. So there's a variety of unregulated sources. And of course, those unregulated sources differ completely depending on what pollutant that you're talking about.
Mhm. Thank you.
Senator Kunish?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Let's see. For the wastewater discharge permit page, there is, if a permit is not approved, what option does the mine have? Can they go back and redo that permit? Do they have like a do-over option, or is it like a one and done?
Assistant Commissioner?
Madam Chair, committee members, I think the way that I would answer that is throughout the permitting process, the drafting of the permit, we're going through these various different analyses, and we are identifying places where we think that there either needs to be a permit limit to control the pollutant, the pollutant in question, or there's something about their operation where we don't believe that it's protective enough to allow them to meet the air quality standard or the water quality standard. And so I mentioned that permit drafting is very iterative. And so we would go back to the company, we would tell them of our concerns, and they would have an opportunity to modify aspects of their process. Maybe they would add some kind of pollution control equipment. Maybe they would change their operation in some particular way. So it's very much an iterative process. And we wouldn't put something out on public notice if we didn't believe that it was protective and that we could issue that permit and be confident that we would be protecting the environment. Does that answer your question?
Yep.
Okay.
That's perfect. Thank you,
Thank you.
Assistant. And
Senator Kunish?
yep, another question, Chair. So when under the stormwater discharge permits, if the geography changes in an area, let's say we have another one of those 100-year storms and it changes the path of a creek or a river, or there's flooding and all of those sort of incidences, would a new permit have to be requested if the geography actually changes in that area?
Assistant Commissioner?
Mr. Chair, committee members, the goal with both the industrial stormwater permit as well as the construction stormwater permit, I'm talking about water permits because I'm most familiar with those, but and I think your question is a water question. But the whole goal with those permits is to keep the water that is generated on the facility at the facility and to not allow it to move off site. And so the way that I understand your question, it would not require a new permit to be reissued, because that industrial facility, whether it's a mining operation or some other type of facility, should not be causing or contributing to any issue going on with any nearby stream or river or creek or lake. That stormwater is supposed to be kept on site and managed on site.
Senator Kunish?
Follow-up, Chair.
Yep.
So what if there was some kind of catastrophe wherever the contaminant was was contained, there was a leak or it deteriorated or a tornado or something changed and it happened, what would happen then?
Assistant Commissioner?
Mr. Chair, committee members, I think one thing, we should have someone online here who is the manager of our industrial wastewater and stormwater program. And if you're okay with this, we'll invite him to answer that question because he may have knowledge of cases like this
Sure.
that he can use to answer the question.
Yes, please. Is he on there? Oh, I see him popped up. Go ahead, just state your name for the record.
Thank you, Chair, members. I'm Jeff Udd. I'm the manager of the water and mining section at the MPCA. And it's a complicated question to answer. I mean, I think the question was posed as a stormwater question, and I would say in instances of stormwater discharges, there wouldn't be a new permit required, but there may be conditions in the permit that would need to be changed and updated and addressed, particularly around the stormwater pollution prevention plan that was highlighted by Assistant Commissioner Bosch's presentation. Now, if you're dealing with a catastrophe, I would think that the first thing that we would want to do is, clean up and mitigate the catastrophe that happened, and then we would worry about permitting situations later. But if there's changes to an operation, we need to address that through permits, whether that's a new permit or an amended permit or changes to some other conditions in the permit.
Senator Kunish?
Yep, follow up. Thank you, Mr. Udd. So if there is a necessity for mitigation or cleanup or those sort of things, who's responsible for that? So if it was the mining company, do they put a deposit down? Are there funds that are reserved for mitigation? Are they 100% responsible for that? Or does the state kind of pick up on that?
Mr. Udd?
Chair, members, so the facility responsible for their operations would cover those costs. If you're talking about remediation, that may or may not involve the MPCA. It could be a DNR issue, depending on what the situation is. But those are the types of funds that are set aside by DNR to address those types of issues in the unlikely event that something like that happens.
Senator Kunish?
Thank you very much. I think you've exhausted my questions.
All
Thank you
right.
very much
Yeah,
for
no
those.
problem. Are there any additional questions from members? Not seeing any. Was there any additional comments from either Mr. McDonald or Mr. Udd?
No comments
Okay.
here, Mr. Chair.
I just wanted to add one thing we asked the DNR about, and I'm just kind of curious where you guys are at, if you happen to have this data available. If not, you can follow up afterwards. But we were kind of curious where they were at or where you guys are at with litigation around either mining and forestry industries, just so we kind of got an outlook of that as well. I know there is some going on within the DNR, and I just wondered if your agency was also a part of that. Assistant Commissioner?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair and committee members. I think Jeff can probably give a more specific answer. I mean, we do have some, I'll just pass it over to Jeff
All right,
so he
perfect.
can give you.
Mr. Udd?
Chair, members, yeah, thanks for the question. So there are some litigation activities that are happening. One that I'm glad is I could report that is concluded is the U.S. Steel Mintac water permit. We did get a decision back from the court on that, and we're actively working on the reissuance based on the issues that were remanded back to us by the court. So that would be the U.S. Steel Mintac water permit. On the Polymet water permit, we got a decision back on that as well. Now, that was just recent I think it was the end of January. So there's a 30-day appeal period for that. So we'll see where that is. I'm not going to speculate one way or another whether litigation will be concluded on that, but the court also remanded one issue back to us on that permit, and that was the functional equivalent analysis. that Assistant Commissioner Vanderbosch had mentioned. There's also the polymet air permit that was litigated. We had made some further findings on that permit and reissued not the permit wasn't reissued, but the actual basis of the findings of fact, statement of basis for that permit was reissued, and that is being challenged again, and we'll see what happens with the Supreme Court, whether they take up that issue or not. But those are the bigger litigation activities that are happening right now.
Thank you for that update. One additional question, Assistant Commissioner. As you guys look at permitting, I'm kind of wondering how they're prioritized and how it works for somebody to get an expedited permit. What is the process for that? And kind of how do you look at prioritizing those? Because I know there's always some consternation around how long it takes to do permitting. I realize there's a process you got to go through, and that's certainly important to do, but I'm just trying to get a better understanding of it for the committee and myself, how that all works, if you could speak to that.
Sure, Mr. Chair and committee members. My guess is that it is a slightly different process depending on whether you're talking about the air permits or the water permits. I'm guessing the two media maybe prioritize a little bit differently. So let's have the Assistant Commissioner for Air answer first.
Mr. McDonald?
Mr. Chair and members, the expedited process for the air permit side requires a applicant to seek the expedited process, in which case what happens then is an air permit engineer agrees to work on that on overtime, and the permit applicant pays for that overtime. So we have to have a signed agreement in place for that individual to work overtime, and that's how they kind of get expedited. So they don't jump the queue per se. It's somebody taking on additional work at the agency to do that. And so it's really up to the bandwidth of our individual permit engineers to agree to that. And typically we do about 4 to 5 permits a year on an expedited basis. Given the complexity of the mining permits, it would be tough to get anybody to volunteer for that kind of work. So we traditionally haven't done any expedited permits on mining because, as I said, they are based on overtime. However, a mine facility is welcome to apply for that.
I don't currently have any additional questions. Any other questions from members? Not seeing any pop up online. So with that, I don't see any other business. I just want to thank you guys for the presentation today and come to have a conversation with us. For any members that have additional questions on permitting for the Pollution Control Agency, they're pretty easy to get a hold of, so feel free to reach out to them. Seeing no other business to come before the committee today, I will make one other mention. I don't think we're going to have a meeting next week. We are going to hear a Senator Thomasoni bill. Next week, he's going to be a little preoccupied on Tuesday. So the week after, I think we're going to try to do that. So, and so just watch your email for that. With that, we are adjourned. Thank you.